Chapter 1. A Boy from Pisa. In the quiet city of Pisa, Italy, a boy was born on February 15th, 1564. His name was Galileo Galilei. Pisa was famous for its leaning tower, but for Galileo the city was full of much more than famous buildings. It was full of questions. Questions about life, about nature, about the stars. Galileo was not born into a rich family. His father, Vincenzo Galilei, was a musician. He played the lute and loved music, but life as a musician was not easy. Vincenzo wanted more for his son. He dreamed that Galileo would become a doctor. Doctors, after all, were respected and earned good money. But young Galileo had other dreams. From the time he was a little boy, Galileo was curious. He looked at the world differently from other children. While others played, Galileo would sit under a tree, staring up at the sky. He wondered, why does the sun rise in the morning and set at night? Where does it go? He watched birds fly and leaves fall. He noticed how they moved, slowly, gently. Why don't they stay in the air? He asked himself. These questions filled his mind. Even when he didn't have answers, he couldn't stop thinking. Galileo's mother, Julia, often worried about him. Why don't you play with the other children? She would ask. A boy needs to run and laugh, not just think all the time. But Galileo only smiled. He liked to play sometimes, too. He loved to climb trees and explore the hills outside Pisa. But even then, his mind was full of wonder. He would stop to look at the shapes of the rocks or how the river water sparkled in the sunlight. Everything around him seemed magical. One day, when Galileo was about 7 years old, something happened that he would never forget. It was a warm evening, and the sky was clear. His father had taken him outside to look at the stars. They sat on a blanket in the cool grass. Vincenzo pointed up. See those tiny lights? They're stars, he said. Galileo stared at the sky. The stars were like diamonds. They twinkled and seemed so far away. What are they made of? Galileo asked. His father laughed softly. No one really knows, he said. Some say they are holes in the sky that let light shine through. Others say they are tiny suns like ours. Galileo's eyes widened. Tiny suns? The idea thrilled him. He wanted to know more, but there were no answers. Not yet. At school, Galileo was different from the other students. He loved learning, but only about the things that interested him. He didn't enjoy memorizing long texts or writing essays. He wanted to ask why. Why did things happen the way they did? Why did the earth feel so solid but seem so small compared to the sky? His teachers often became frustrated with him. Stop asking so many questions, they said. But Galileo couldn't stop. He wanted to understand the world, not just accept what he was told. One afternoon, while helping his mother in the kitchen, Galileo made a discovery. He had been playing with a small clay jar. He noticed that when he tilted the jar, it made a different sound depending on how much water was inside. A higher pitch when it was nearly empty. A lower pitch when it was full. He showed his mother. Listen, he said excitedly. The sound changes because of the water. Julia nodded, smiling. Yes, Galileo, but why does it matter? Galileo couldn't explain it then, but he knew it was important. It was one of the first times he had noticed patterns in nature. As Galileo grew older, his curiosity only deepened. He read every book he could find. He loved stories about the ancient Greeks and their ideas about the universe. He learned about philosophers like Aristotle, who believed the earth was the center of everything. Galileo respected these ideas, but felt something was missing. How can we know for sure? He wondered. What if they are wrong? At the age of 10, Galileo's life changed. His family moved to Florence, a bigger and busier city than Pisa. Florence was full of art, music, and learning. It was exciting, but it was also challenging. Galileo missed the quiet of Pisa. Still, he found new opportunities in Florence. He began to study with private tutors who noticed his talent for mathematics. "This boy has a gift," one tutor told Vincenzo. Galileo was proud. He loved numbers and how they could describe the world. They felt like a secret language only he could understand. Despite his love for learning, life wasn't always easy for Galileo. His family struggled with money. Vincenzo often reminded him, "You must study hard to become a doctor. It's the only way to have a good life." Galileo tried to follow his father's wishes. He entered the University of Pisa when he was 17, ready to study medicine. But deep down, he wasn't happy. He found the lectures boring. He didn't want to study plants and the human body. He wanted to study the stars, the earth, and the way things moved. One day at university, Galileo attended a lecture about mathematics. The professor spoke about geometry and the beauty of shapes. Galileo was amazed. He realized that math wasn't just about numbers. It was a tool to understand everything. From that moment, his path became clear. He would not become a doctor. He would follow his true passion, science. But leaving medicine wasn't an easy decision. His father was furious. "You're throwing away your future," Vincenzo shouted. "No one makes money with mathematics." Galileo was sad to disappoint his father, but he couldn't ignore his heart. He promised himself that one day he would make his family proud. Galileo's love for discovery grew stronger each day. He began experimenting with objects, testing how they moved. He watched pendulums swing back and forth. He dropped balls from different heights to see how fast they fell. People around him thought he was odd. Some even laughed. "Why waste time on such silly things?" they said. But Galileo didn't care. He knew these experiments would help him find answers to his questions. By the time Galileo was in his early 20s, his ideas were starting to take shape. He believed the world was full of patterns waiting to be discovered. Every star, every drop of water, every grain of sand had a story to tell. He just needed to listen. As he looked back on his childhood in Pisa, Galileo realized how much it had shaped him. The leaning tower, the stars above, and even the quiet evenings with his father had all left their mark. They had given him a deep love for learning and a hunger for truth. Galileo didn't know it yet, but his journey was only beginning. The stars still called to him, and he was determined to answer. He was ready to change the way people saw the world. Forever. Chapter 2. The Music of the Spheres. Galileo's father, Vincenzo Galilei, was not a scientist. He was a musician. He played the lute, a beautiful stringed instrument, and his music filled their home with life. Galileo loved the sound of his father's playing. The soft, gentle notes seemed to tell stories without words. Music wasn't just noise to Vincenzo. It was a language, a way of understanding the world. From an early age, Vincenzo taught Galileo to listen. "Pay attention," he would say. "Every note has meaning. Every sound has a pattern." Galileo took his father's words to heart. He listened not just to music, but to the world around him. He noticed the rustling of the wind in the trees. He heard the steady rhythm of raindrops on the roof. He even listened to his own footsteps, soft on the dirt paths of Pisa. One evening, as Vincenzo tuned his lute, he called Galileo to his side. "Do you know why the strings make different sounds?" he asked. Galileo shook his head. Vincenzo explained, "It's because of their length and tightness. The shorter the string, the higher the note." Galileo's eyes lit up. He plucked the strings himself and listened closely. His father was right. Each string made a unique sound, and the pattern fascinated him. Music wasn't just about sound for Galileo, it was about discovery. He began to notice patterns everywhere. The way birds flapped their wings in a rhythm, the way waves rolled onto the shore, one after the other. The world, he realized, was full of hidden music. All you had to do was listen. One day, Vincenzo showed Galileo something extraordinary. He placed two strings side by side and plucked them. When they were the same length, they made the same note. But when one string was half as long, it made a note that was higher, exactly double the pitch. "Do you hear it?" Vincenzo asked. "That's harmony. It's mathematics in music." Galileo's jaw dropped. He had never thought about numbers in this way before. Numbers weren't just for counting. They could explain beauty. They could explain sound. Galileo became obsessed with finding patterns in music. He spent hours watching his father work. Vincenzo experimented with strings and sounds, trying to create new musical scales. "You see," he told Galileo, "music and science are not so different. Both are about understanding how things work." These words stayed with Galileo for the rest of his life. But Galileo's love of music wasn't just about numbers. It was about emotion. When his father played, Galileo felt something deep inside him. Joy, sadness, wonder. Music had the power to move people. This, too, was a kind of pattern. A pattern of feelings. Galileo began to wonder, could the whole universe be like this? Could the stars and planets follow their own music, their own harmony? One night, as Vincenzo played a slow, haunting melody, Galileo looked up at the sky. The stars were bright and countless, scattered like tiny sparks across the darkness. He thought about what his father had said, about harmony and mathematics. Could the stars have their own rhythm? Could the planets follow a kind of cosmic music? The idea thrilled him. He couldn't prove it, but he felt in his heart that it was true. Galileo began to see connections everywhere. When the wind blew through the trees, it sounded like a flute. When he dropped a pebble into a pond, the ripples spread out in perfect circles, like the notes of a song. Even the way people walked had a rhythm, slow or fast, soft or loud. Galileo realized that patterns weren't just in music. They were in everything. One day, Galileo's father gave him a special gift. It was an old, worn lute, smaller than the one Vincenzo played. "This is for you," his father said. "Learn to play, learn to listen." Galileo was overjoyed. He practiced every day, plucking the strings and listening to the notes. At first, his fingers stumbled. The notes were messy, but over time, he improved. The more he played, the more he felt connected to the music. It wasn't just about making sound. It was about understanding the world. Galileo's brothers and sisters sometimes teased him. "Why do you spend so much time with that lute?" they asked. "You should be outside playing games." But Galileo didn't mind. The lute was his way of exploring. Each string, each note, was like a tiny mystery waiting to be solved. As he grew older, Galileo's curiosity only deepened. He began to ask bigger questions. If music could have patterns, could the stars? Could the planets? These thoughts kept him awake at night. He would lie on his back, staring at the sky, and imagine the universe as one great symphony. Each star, each planet, was like a note in a song too vast and beautiful to hear. One evening, as Vincenzo played a lively tune, Galileo interrupted him. "Father," he asked, "do you think the stars have music?" Vincenzo smiled. "Perhaps," he said. "The ancient Greeks believed the heavens made music. They called it the music of the spheres." Galileo's heart raced. The music of the spheres. The idea was like a spark in his mind. He imagined the planets spinning in space, each one creating its own sound. Together, they would make a harmony, a perfect, endless song. Galileo couldn't stop thinking about it. The music of the spheres became a dream, a mystery he wanted to solve. He didn't have the tools to prove it, but he believed that mathematics was the key. Just as numbers explain the notes of a lute, they could explain the movements of the stars. Years later, when Galileo became a scientist, he often thought of his father. Vincenzo had taught him more than just music. He had taught him how to listen, to sounds, to patterns, to the universe itself. Music and science were forever linked in Galileo's heart. They were two sides of the same coin, both searching for the same thing: truth. Even as an adult, Galileo would sometimes close his eyes and imagine the music of the spheres. He could almost hear it, the hum of the planets, the rhythm of the stars. It was a song that no one could hear, but he believed it was there. And that belief drove him to explore, to discover, and to change the way we see the universe. Galileo's childhood in Pisa had given him curiosity. His father's music had given him the tools to understand it. Together, they had planted the seeds of a mind that would one day unlock the secrets of the cosmos. For Galileo, the universe was not silent. It was alive, full of sound and wonder. All he had to do was listen. Chapter 3. The Apple That Fell, but not on Galileo. In the quiet garden of his family home, Galileo sat under a tree. The air was warm, and the leaves rustled gently in the breeze. It was a peaceful afternoon, but Galileo's mind was far from quiet. His thoughts were full of questions. He always had questions. As he sat there, lost in thought, something happened. A small apple fell from the tree above him. It landed softly on the grass, just a few feet away. Most people wouldn't think twice about such a simple event. But Galileo wasn't like most people. He stared at the apple for a moment. Then, he picked it up and held it in his hands. Why did it fall? He wondered aloud. And why did it fall straight down, not sideways or up? He turned the apple over, examining it as if it might hold the answer. The question seemed simple, but the more he thought about it, the more mysterious it became. Galileo stood up and looked at the tree. He noticed the way the branches stretched upward, reaching for the sunlight. The apples hung from their stems, still and quiet. Yet, when one let go, it fell straight to the ground. Why? What force pulled it down? Galileo's heart raced. He felt as though he were on the edge of a great discovery, even if he didn't yet know what it was. Later that evening, Galileo sat at the dinner table with his family. He couldn't stop thinking about the apple. His younger siblings were laughing and talking, but Galileo barely noticed. He was deep in thought. "Galileo," his father said, interrupting his silence, "what's on your mind?" Galileo blinked and looked up. "The apple," he said simply. His father raised an eyebrow. "What about it?" Galileo hesitated. How could he explain the strange feeling the falling apple had given him? "Why did it fall straight down?" he asked. His father smiled faintly and shrugged. "Because that's what apples do." But Galileo wasn't satisfied with this answer. After dinner, Galileo went back outside. The garden was quiet now, bathed in the soft light of the moon. He sat under the same tree and stared up at the sky. The stars twinkled as if they were winking at him, sharing a secret. "Do the stars fall?" he whispered. "Do they follow the same rules as the apple?" These questions burned in his mind, and he knew he wouldn't rest until he found answers. As the weeks passed, Galileo began experimenting. He climbed trees and dropped small objects, watching how they fell. He noticed that heavier objects didn't fall faster than lighter ones. This surprised him. Most people believed that heavy things should fall faster, but Galileo's experiments showed otherwise. He repeated his tests over and over, just to be sure. Each time, the result was the same. The objects fell at the same speed, no matter how heavy they were. Galileo's discoveries made him feel both excited and confused. If heavy objects didn't fall faster, then what made them fall at all? What force was at work? He didn't have the tools to answer these questions yet. But he didn't let that stop him. He kept thinking, kept testing, and kept dreaming. One day, while walking through the streets of Pisa, Galileo saw something that caught his attention. Workers were unloading heavy sacks of grain from a cart. They were dropping the sacks onto the ground, one by one. The sacks hit the ground with a dull thud, raising small clouds of dust. Galileo stopped and watched. He noticed how the sacks all fell straight down, no matter how high they were dropped from. He felt a spark of understanding. "It's not just apples," he thought. "Everything falls this way." Galileo began to see falling objects everywhere he went. A child dropped a toy. A bird's feather floated to the ground. Even raindrops falling from the sky followed the same pattern. The world was full of falling things, and Galileo's curiosity grew with each new observation. But not everyone understood his fascination. "Why are you so interested in falling apples?" his friends teased him. "What's the big deal?" Galileo laughed, but didn't try to explain. How could he make them see what he saw? To them, an apple was just an apple. To Galileo, it was a key to unlocking the secrets of the universe. At the University of Pisa, where Galileo studied, he continued to explore his ideas about falling objects. He shared his experiments with his professors, but many of them didn't believe him. Aristotle said heavy objects fall faster, they argued. And Aristotle was never wrong. But Galileo wasn't convinced. "Have you ever tested it?" he asked them. They shook their heads. Galileo felt frustrated. How could they be so sure if they had never tried it for themselves? Determined to prove his point, Galileo decided to conduct a bold experiment. According to legend, he climbed to the top of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. With a crowd of students and professors watching, he dropped 2 objects of different weights from the tower. Both objects hit the ground at the same time. The crowd gasped. Galileo's theory was right. Heavy objects did not fall faster than light ones. For Galileo, it was a moment of triumph. But for some of his professors, it was a challenge to their old beliefs. Galileo's experiment made him both famous and controversial. People began to talk about the young man who dared to question Aristotle. Some admired his courage. Others thought he was arrogant. Galileo didn't care what people thought. He cared about the truth. Even as his ideas gained attention, Galileo remained humble. He knew there was still so much he didn't understand. Why did objects fall at all? What force pulled them down? He didn't have the answers yet, but he was determined to keep searching. As Galileo walked home one evening, he passed by the same apple tree in his family's garden. He stopped and looked up at its branches, now heavy with fruit. He thought about the apple that had fallen weeks ago. It seemed like such a small thing, yet it had sparked so many questions. Galileo smiled to himself. Sometimes the smallest events lead to the biggest discoveries. That night, as he lay in bed, Galileo stared out his window at the stars. He thought about how they seemed so still, so far away? Did the stars follow the same rules as the apple? Did they move through the heavens in a way he could understand? These thoughts filled his dreams, pushing him forward on his journey. Galileo didn't know it yet, but his questions about falling objects would one day change the world. He would go on to make discoveries that no one had imagined. But it all began with a single moment, an apple falling softly to the ground, and a boy who dared to ask, "Why?" Chapter 4. A New World of Numbers. When Galileo arrived at the University of Pisa, his father was proud. Vincenzo Galilei had worked hard to send his son there. He dreamed that Galileo would become a doctor, a man of great respect and wealth. Medicine, Vincenzo believed, was the only way to guarantee a successful life. But Galileo's heart, it told him something different. At first, Galileo tried to follow his father's wishes. He sat in long lectures about the human body. He read heavy books filled with descriptions of illnesses and cures. The professors spoke about blood, bones, and treatments. But to Galileo, it all felt wrong. He didn't dislike medicine, but he couldn't connect with it. It didn't spark his curiosity. He felt restless. One day, as Galileo walked through the university courtyard, he heard a voice that stopped him in his tracks. It was a professor giving a lecture outside, speaking to a group of students. The subject was mathematics. Galileo couldn't help himself. He joined the group, standing quietly at the back, listening. The professor spoke about shapes and angles, about patterns in the natural world. Galileo felt a jolt of excitement. For the first time, something made sense. Numbers, he realized, were not just for counting. They were a language, a way to describe the world. After that day, Galileo couldn't stay away from the mathematics lectures. Whenever he had free time, he sneaked into the classrooms where they were taught. He sat at the back, scribbling notes and soaking up every word. He learned about geometry, algebra, and the ancient ideas of the Greeks. Each new concept opened his mind further. He felt like he had discovered a secret world. But Galileo's fascination with mathematics soon became a problem. His medical studies began to suffer. He spent more time solving equations than reading about diseases. His professors noticed. So did his father. Vincenzo received a letter from the university. It said that Galileo was falling behind in his studies. Vincenzo was furious. He wrote back, demanding that his son focus on medicine. But Galileo couldn't do it. His heart was pulling him in another direction. One evening, Galileo sat with his father in their family home during a holiday break. The air was tense. Vincenzo paced the room, his voice sharp. "You promised me you would study medicine," he said. "Do you want to waste your life on numbers?" Galileo sat quietly, his head down. Finally, he looked up. "Father," he said softly, "math isn't just numbers. It's everything. It explains how the world works. I can't ignore it." Vincenzo stared at his son. He didn't understand, but he saw the determination in Galileo's eyes. He sighed and shook his head. "You're making a mistake," he said. But Galileo didn't think so. Back at the university, Galileo threw himself into his new passion. He read every book on mathematics he could find. He learned about the great thinkers, Pythagoras, who had discovered the relationship between music and numbers, Euclid, whose geometry described the shapes of the world, and Archimedes, who had uncovered the secrets of levers and balance. These men became Galileo's heroes. Their ideas inspired him. They made him believe he could uncover new truths, too. One of Galileo's favorite places at the university was the cathedral. It wasn't because of the prayers or the artwork, though both were beautiful. It was because of the chandelier. The large metal chandelier hung high above the ground. It swayed gently back and forth, moved by the breeze or the footsteps of visitors. Galileo noticed something strange about it. No matter how far the chandelier swung, it always took the same amount of time to complete one swing. This fascinated him. He began timing it with his pulse, counting the beats of his heart. The rhythm was perfect. He had discovered a pattern. Galileo realized that the motion of the chandelier wasn't random. It was predictable, and it could be described with numbers. He didn't know it then, but this discovery would one day lead to important inventions, like the pendulum clock. At that moment, though, Galileo was simply amazed. Once again, mathematics had revealed something hidden in the world. As Galileo's knowledge grew, so did his reputation. His professors began to notice his talent. "This young man is a genius," one of them said. Soon, other students came to Galileo for help with their work. He explained things in a way that was clear and simple, and he loved sharing what he had learned. Teaching became a new passion for him. But not everyone admired Galileo. Some of the older professors were suspicious of him. They didn't like how he questioned the traditional teachings. For centuries, Aristotle's ideas had been accepted as truth. To them, questioning Aristotle was dangerous. But Galileo wasn't afraid. He believed that true knowledge came from observation and testing, not just from books. One day, during a mathematics lecture, Galileo's professor announced a challenge. "If anyone can explain the motion of objects in a better way than Aristotle, let him speak," he said. The room went silent. No one dared to question Aristotle. No one, except Galileo. Slowly, he raised his hand. The professor stared at him. "Go ahead, young man," he said. Galileo stood up, his heart pounding. He walked to the front of the room and picked up a small ball. He held it in his hand, then let it fall to the ground. "Aristotle said that heavy objects fall faster than light ones," he began. "But that's not true. I've tested it. Objects fall at the same speed, no matter their weight." The students whispered to one another. The professor frowned. "Show us," he said. Galileo performed his experiment right there in the classroom. He dropped two objects of different weights from the same height. They hit the ground at the same time. The students gasped. The professor said nothing. Galileo felt a rush of pride. He had proven his point. That moment marked a turning point for Galileo. He realized that he could challenge old ideas and find new truths, but he also knew it wouldn't be easy. The world wasn't ready for new ways of thinking. Many people clung to tradition. They were afraid of change. Despite the challenges, Galileo never gave up. He continued to explore the mysteries of mathematics and nature. Numbers became his guide, leading him to discoveries that no one had imagined. He saw patterns in the stars, the waves, and even the way objects moved. To him, the universe was like a great book, written in the language of mathematics. And Galileo was determined to read it. As he walked through the university courtyard one evening, Galileo looked up at the sky. The stars were bright and countless, scattered across the darkness. He felt a sense of wonder. The same patterns he had seen in numbers, in swinging chandeliers, and falling objects must also exist in the heavens. He didn't know how to prove it yet, but he believed it with all his heart. Galileo's journey into the world of numbers had only just begun. His decision to leave medicine behind was not an easy one, but it was the right one. He had found his true calling. Mathematics wasn't just a subject to him. It was a way of seeing, a way of understanding. It was, as he would later say, the language of the universe. Chapter 5. Starry Nights in Padua. Galileo arrived in Padua in 1592. The city was busy and full of life. It was known for its great university, where some of the brightest minds gathered to learn and teach. Galileo had been invited to become a professor of mathematics. It was a proud moment for him. He was only 28 years old and already seen as a rising star in the academic world. Padua felt like a fresh start. The city was surrounded by rivers and canals, and the air was filled with the sounds of people working, laughing, and talking. Galileo's new job gave him freedom. He could teach what he loved, mathematics and science. But it also gave him time to explore his greatest passion, the mysteries of the universe. Galileo's evenings in Padua were his favorite. After long days of teaching, he would step outside and look up at the night sky. The stars were bright and countless, scattered like tiny jewels across the darkness. Galileo couldn't stop staring. He wondered, what were they made of? How far away were they? Did they move? These questions filled his mind, keeping him awake late into the night. The more Galileo looked at the stars, the more he wanted to understand them. But his eyes alone weren't enough. He needed something to help him see better, to bring the stars closer. He began to think of how he could create a tool for this purpose. He had heard of a new invention from Holland, a device called a spyglass. It allowed people to see faraway objects more clearly. Galileo was curious. He decided to make one himself. With steady hands and a sharp mind, Galileo began experimenting. He worked late into the night, grinding glass into lenses and fitting them into tubes. It wasn't easy. Sometimes the lenses didn't fit. Sometimes the images were blurry. But Galileo didn't give up. After weeks of hard work, he finally built a spyglass of his own. He held it up to his eye and looked at a distant tower. For the first time, he saw it as if it were right in front of him. His heart raced. If this tool worked on Earth, what could it reveal about the heavens? Galileo didn't stop there. He kept improving his invention, making the lenses stronger and clearer. Soon, his spyglass could magnify objects 20 times their size. It was unlike anything the world had seen before. Galileo gave it a new name: the telescope. He was thrilled. Now, he could turn his gaze to the stars. One cool evening, Galileo carried his telescope to the rooftop of his house. The city was quiet, the streets below lit by the soft glow of lanterns. Above him, the sky was vast and endless. With trembling hands, he lifted the telescope and pointed it at the moon. What he saw took his breath away. The moon wasn't smooth, as people had always believed. Through the telescope, Galileo saw mountains and valleys, shadows and light. The surface was rough, like the earth. It was a world of its own. He sketched what he saw, his hand moving quickly over the paper. He couldn't wait to show others. Galileo turned his telescope to the stars next. He was amazed. What looked like a single star to the naked eye became a cluster of many stars through the telescope. The universe was far larger and more detailed than anyone had imagined. Each discovery felt like a small miracle. But the most incredible discovery came when Galileo pointed his telescope at Jupiter. He saw something no one had ever seen before: 4 tiny dots of light near the planet. At first, he thought they were stars. But as he watched them night after night, he realized they weren't still. They moved. They were moons orbiting Jupiter. Galileo was stunned. This changed everything. It was proof that not everything revolved around the earth, as people had believed for centuries. Galileo's discoveries filled him with excitement, but they also made him nervous. He knew his findings would challenge the old ideas of the universe, especially the teachings of Aristotle and the Church. Still, he couldn't keep his discoveries to himself. He wrote a book describing what he had seen. He included detailed sketches of the moon, the stars, and Jupiter's moons. He called the book The Starry Messenger. When the book was published, it caused a sensation. People couldn't believe what Galileo was saying. Some praised him for opening their eyes to a new universe. Others accused him of lying. "How can the moon have mountains?" they asked. "How can Jupiter have moons?" Galileo invited them to look through his telescope, but many refused. They didn't want to believe what they saw. Despite the criticism, Galileo continued his work. His telescope became famous, and rulers and scholars across Europe wanted to see it. Galileo traveled to show his invention and share his discoveries. He felt proud, but he also felt the weight of responsibility. He wasn't just a scientist anymore. He was a man who was changing how people saw the world. At night, back in Padua, Galileo often sat alone on his rooftop. The stars above were constant, shining as they always had. But now they felt closer. He knew there was still so much to learn, so many mysteries to uncover. His telescope was only the beginning. He dreamed of finding more moons, more stars, and more truths about the universe. Galileo's time in Padua was a turning point in his life. It was here that he became not just a teacher, but a pioneer. He had opened a window to the heavens, and he wasn't afraid to look through it. The sky was no longer a distant mystery. It was a world full of secrets, waiting to be explored. Even as he lay in bed at night, Galileo couldn't stop thinking about the stars. He imagined what future generations might discover. He hoped they would ask questions, just as he had. After all, curiosity was what had brought him this far, and he knew it would lead him even further. Galileo didn't know what challenges lay ahead. He didn't know that his discoveries would bring him into conflict with powerful authorities. But in that moment, under the starry sky of Padua, he felt nothing but wonder. The universe was vast, beautiful, and full of possibilities. And Galileo was ready to keep searching for its secrets. Before we begin, Chapter 6, a quick note for our listeners. You're currently listening to this audiobook on Woonglish. Remember, this content is specially made for Woonglish listeners only. If you're hearing it on any other channel, it may be a violation of Woonglish's rights. Please ensure you're tuned into the right source to fully enjoy and respect this audiobook journey. Now, let's continue the story. Chapter 6, The Invention That Shook the Heavens. Galileo worked late into the night, his small workshop lit by a single candle. On the table in front of him lay lenses, tubes, and tools. His hands were steady, but his heart raced. He had spent weeks carefully grinding glass and shaping lenses, trying to perfect a device he had only dreamed of. Now, it was nearly ready. He took a deep breath and assembled the final pieces. It was done. He held it up and whispered to himself, "Let's see." The device was simple but powerful. Galileo had built a telescope, an invention that would change everything. It wasn't the first telescope in the world, but it was the best. While others could barely magnify distant objects, Galileo's telescope was far stronger. It could make things appear 20 times closer than they really were. He couldn't wait to use it. That evening, Galileo climbed the stairs to the roof of his home in Padua. The city below was quiet, its streets empty and dark. Above him stretched the night sky, endless and full of stars. He raised the telescope to his eye, his hands trembling. For the first time, he looked at the heavens in a way no one else had before. The first thing Galileo pointed his telescope at was the moon. Through the lens, the moon transformed. It was no longer a smooth, glowing disk. Instead, Galileo saw mountains, valleys, and craters. Shadows stretched across its surface, revealing its rugged terrain. The moon, he realized, was a world of its own. It wasn't perfect, as many believed. It was rough and complex, just like the Earth. Galileo's heart pounded with excitement. He grabbed a piece of paper and began to sketch what he saw. He drew the jagged edges of the moon's mountains and the deep, dark craters. Each detail amazed him. How could no one have seen this before? He felt as if he were discovering a new land, a place no one had ever visited. But Galileo didn't stop there. He turned his telescope toward the stars. What looked like tiny pinpoints of light to the naked eye became clusters of stars through his telescope. Some of these stars were so faint that no one had ever noticed them before. The universe, Galileo realized, was far bigger than anyone had imagined. There were more stars in the sky than could be counted. Then Galileo pointed his telescope at Jupiter, the largest planet in the sky. He saw something extraordinary. Near the planet were 4 tiny points of light. At first, he thought they were distant stars. But as he watched night after night, he noticed something strange. The points of light moved. They weren't fixed like stars. They were moons, orbiting around Jupiter. This was a revolutionary discovery. For centuries, people believed that everything in the universe revolved around the Earth. But here was proof that it wasn't true. These moons revolved around Jupiter, not the Earth. The old idea that the Earth was the center of everything began to crumble. Galileo was filled with a mix of emotions. He was thrilled by what he had seen, but he also knew that his discoveries would cause controversy. People didn't like to have their beliefs challenged. Still, Galileo couldn't keep this to himself. He had to share what he had found. He began writing about his discoveries, describing the wonders he had seen through his telescope. His book, The Starry Messenger, was filled with sketches of the moon, Jupiter's moons, and the stars. When it was published, it caused a sensation. People across Europe were amazed. Some praised Galileo for revealing the secrets of the heavens. Others were skeptical. "How do we know this is true?" they asked. "How can we believe what we cannot see with our own eyes?" Galileo invited skeptics to look through his telescope. Some were astonished. They saw the mountains on the moon, the stars in clusters, and the tiny moons of Jupiter. Others, however, refused to even look. "This cannot be real," they insisted. They clung to the old ideas, unwilling to accept the truth. Galileo didn't let the doubters stop him. He continued to improve his telescope and explore the skies. Each night brought new discoveries. He saw the phases of Venus, which showed that it orbited the sun. He noticed that Saturn seemed to have ears on either side, though he couldn't yet see clearly enough to recognize them as rings. The more he looked, the more he realized how little humanity knew about the universe. But Galileo's work wasn't just about making discoveries. He wanted to change the way people thought. He believed that science wasn't about blindly following tradition. It was about observing the world, testing ideas, and finding the truth. "The universe is written in the language of mathematics," he once said. "To understand it, we must learn to read that language." Despite his groundbreaking work, Galileo faced challenges. Many scholars and church leaders were angry. His discoveries contradicted the teachings of Aristotle, which had been accepted for centuries. More importantly, they seemed to challenge the teachings of the Church. The idea that the earth was not the center of the universe was dangerous. It threatened the way people understood their place in creation. Galileo knew he was walking a fine line, but he couldn't stop. The sky called to him, and he felt it was his duty to answer. He believed that science and faith could coexist. "The Bible tells us how to go to heaven," he said, "but it doesn't tell us how the heavens go." As Galileo continued his work, he couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. Each night, as he gazed through his telescope, he was reminded of the vastness of the universe, the stars, the planets, the moons. They were all part of a grand design, more beautiful and more complicated than anyone had ever imagined. And yet, with each discovery, Galileo felt closer to understanding it. One evening, as he packed away his telescope, Galileo looked up at the sky with his own eyes. The stars seemed smaller and dimmer now, compared to what he had seen through his invention, but they still held their magic. What else is out there? He wondered. What secrets are waiting to be discovered? Galileo's telescope was more than a tool. It was a doorway to the unknown. Through it, he had seen the universe as it truly was, vast, dynamic, and full of wonder. His invention had shaken the heavens, but it had also opened them. Galileo knew he was only at the beginning of a journey that would continue for generations. The sky was no longer a mystery. It was an invitation. Chapter 7. Jupiter's Dancing Moons. One cold evening in January, 1610, Galileo climbed to the rooftop of his home in Padua. The city below was silent, and the air was crisp. Above him, the stars sparkled brightly in the clear sky. Galileo carried his telescope, carefully adjusting its position. He had pointed it at the moon and the stars many times before. But tonight, he decided to look at something new. His target was Jupiter, the largest planet in the heavens. Jupiter was visible to the naked eye, shining steadily in the night sky. Galileo had always admired it. But now, with his telescope, he could see it more clearly than ever before. He raised the device to his eye and gasped. There it was, a glowing sphere, perfect and round, unlike the tiny dots of light that were stars. But something else caught his attention. Near Jupiter were 3 smaller dots of light. They were faint but distinct, like tiny stars hovering close to the planet. At first, Galileo thought they were ordinary stars, but he was curious. He decided to watch Jupiter every night to see if anything changed. The next evening, he climbed to the roof again and looked through his telescope. To his surprise, the tiny dots of light were in different positions. They had moved. Galileo frowned, puzzled. Stars didn't move like this. What could they be? Night after night, Galileo observed Jupiter. He noticed something remarkable. The tiny lights were not random. They moved around Jupiter, following a clear pattern. Soon he discovered a 4th dot of light, smaller and fainter than the others. These were not stars. They were moons. Galileo realized he had made a groundbreaking discovery. Jupiter had its own moons, just like Earth had the moon. This discovery filled Galileo with excitement. For centuries, people believed that everything in the universe revolved around the Earth. The Earth was thought to be the center of all creation, with the sun, moon, planets, and stars circling around it. But now Galileo had proof that this wasn't true. Jupiter's moons showed that not everything revolved around the Earth. The old ideas were wrong. Galileo named the 4 moons after the powerful Medici family who ruled Florence and were his patrons. He called them the Medicean stars. He believed this discovery would bring him great fame and help secure support for his work. But Galileo's discovery was about more than fame. It was about truth. It was about changing the way people saw the universe. He began writing down his observations in a book. He carefully described how the moons moved around Jupiter, showing that their orbits were predictable and regular. He sketched diagrams of their positions, night by night. His writing was clear and detailed, making it easy for others to follow his work. He was proud of his findings and eager to share them with the world. When Galileo's book, The Starry Messenger, was published, it caused a sensation. People were amazed by what he had discovered. The idea of moons orbiting Jupiter was shocking. It proved that the heavens were not as simple as people had believed. The universe was far more complex and far more beautiful. But not everyone welcomed Galileo's discoveries. Many scholars and religious leaders were deeply upset. For centuries, the teachings of Aristotle and the Church had gone unchallenged. These teachings placed the Earth at the center of the universe, with everything else revolving around it. To question this was seen as dangerous, even heretical. Some critics dismissed Galileo's findings. How can we believe what he says? They argued. These moons cannot be real. They are tricks of the telescope. Others refused to even look through his telescope, insisting that it was impossible for Jupiter to have moons. They clung to their old beliefs, unwilling to accept the evidence in front of them. Galileo was frustrated by their refusal to listen. He invited skeptics to see for themselves, to look through his telescope and witness the moons orbiting Jupiter. Some were amazed and admitted he was right. But others stubbornly denied what they saw. They claimed the telescope was an unreliable tool, that it distorted reality. Despite the criticism, Galileo remained determined. He knew his discoveries were true. He continued to observe Jupiter and its moons, refining his observations and gathering more evidence. Each night, as he gazed through his telescope, he felt a deep sense of wonder. The tiny dots of light moved in perfect harmony, like dancers circling their partner. It was a cosmic ballet, beautiful and precise. Galileo's discovery of Jupiter's moons was more than just a scientific achievement. It challenged the way people thought about the universe and their place in it. If Jupiter had its own moons, then perhaps the Earth was not the center of everything. Perhaps there were other worlds out there, waiting to be discovered. But Galileo's work also brought him trouble. Some of the church leaders saw his discoveries as a threat to their authority. They believed that accepting Galileo's ideas would weaken the church's teachings. Galileo knew he was walking a dangerous path, but he couldn't stop. He was driven by a desire for truth, a desire to understand the universe as it truly was. As time went on, Galileo's telescope revealed even more wonders. He saw the phases of Venus, which proved that it orbited the sun. He saw Saturn, though his telescope wasn't strong enough to show its rings clearly. He even observed the Milky Way, discovering that it was made up of countless stars. Each discovery confirmed what Galileo had long suspected. The universe was far larger and more complex than anyone had imagined. The Earth was not the center of everything. It was just one small part of a vast, mysterious cosmos. One night, as Galileo gazed at Jupiter and its moons, he felt a sense of peace. The tiny lights moved steadily, following their orbits without fail. They were constant, unchanging, a reminder of the order and beauty of the universe. Galileo smiled. Despite the challenges he faced, he felt lucky to witness such wonders. He knew he was part of something much bigger than himself. Galileo's discovery of Jupiter's moons changed the course of history. It challenged old ideas and opened the door to new ways of thinking. It showed that science was not about accepting what others said, but about questioning, observing, and discovering. Galileo's telescope had revealed a universe full of surprises, a universe waiting to be explored. And though many doubted him, Galileo believed in the power of truth. The moons of Jupiter danced in the heavens, and Galileo had seen them. No amount of denial could change that. Chapter 8. A Dangerous Idea. Galileo's telescope had opened the heavens. He had seen the craters on the moons of Jupiter, and the stars in their endless clusters. Each discovery brought him closer to a daring conclusion. The Earth, he believed, was not the center of the universe. It moved. It revolved around the sun, just as Copernicus had suggested many years before. The idea was thrilling, but it was also dangerous. For centuries, people believed that Earth was the center of everything. This belief wasn't just scientific. It was deeply tied to religion. The church taught that God had placed the earth at the center of creation. To question this was to question God's plan. It was more than a scientific debate. It was a challenge to authority, tradition, and faith. But Galileo couldn't ignore the evidence. His telescope showed him truths that no one could deny. The phases of Venus proved it orbited the sun. Jupiter's moons revolved around their planet, not Earth. And the stars seemed farther away than anyone had imagined, spread across an infinite universe. Galileo felt sure Copernicus was right. Galileo decided to share his ideas. He believed that people deserved to know the truth. Science is not a threat to faith, he told his friends. It is a way of understanding God's creation. He began writing and speaking about his discoveries. His passion was clear, his excitement contagious. But not everyone was ready to listen. In 1616, Galileo published a letter defending the ideas of Copernicus. He wrote that the Earth was not stationary. It moved around the sun, part of a larger, dynamic universe. He argued that this did not contradict the Bible. The Bible, he explained, taught spiritual truths, not scientific facts. But his words stirred controversy. Some scholars and priests were furious. "How dare he question the teachings of Aristotle and the Church?" they said. "Who is he to claim such things?" They accused Galileo of arrogance, of trying to overturn centuries of knowledge. The idea that the Earth moved seemed ridiculous and deeply threatening. Galileo tried to stay calm. He invited his critics to look through his telescope. "See for yourselves," he said. Some did and were astonished by what they saw, but others refused. "The telescope lies," they said. "The Earth cannot move. It is written in the Bible." The Church began to take notice of Galileo. His ideas were spreading quickly, and many feared the consequences. If people believed the Earth moved, they might begin to doubt other teachings. They might question the Church's authority. To stop this, the Church declared that the Copernican system was heretical. Copernicus's books were banned. Galileo was warned to keep silent. For a time, Galileo obeyed. He continued his scientific work, but avoided discussing the motion of the Earth. Inside, however, he struggled. He felt like a prisoner in his own mind, unable to speak the truths he had discovered. The universe was so full of wonder, and he was forced to stay silent about it. Years passed. In 1623, a new pope, Urban VIII, came to power. Urban was known to be more open-minded than his predecessors, and Galileo hoped this would change things. He traveled to Rome to meet the Pope and present his ideas. Urban welcomed Galileo warmly. He admired his intellect and respected his work. Galileo felt hopeful. Encouraged by this meeting, Galileo decided to write a book. He called it Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. In this book, he compared the old Earth-centered model of the universe with a new sun-centered model. The book was written as a conversation between three characters: one who defended the old system, one who supported Copernicus, and one who acted as a neutral observer. Galileo believed this approach would make the subject easier to understand and less controversial. When the book was published in 1632, it caused an uproar. Galileo's arguments were clear, logical, and persuasive. He showed how the Copernican model explained the motions of the planets far better than the old model. The book became widely read, sparking debates across Europe. Many people began to question the Earth-centered universe. But the Church was not pleased. Although Galileo had tried to be careful, his book was seen as a direct challenge to its authority. Some accused him of mocking the Pope, claiming that one of the characters in the book represented Urban VIII. Galileo denied this, but the damage was done. The Church summoned him to Rome to stand trial. Galileo was old and in poor health, but he had no choice. In 1633, he appeared before the Inquisition, the powerful court of the Catholic Church. The trial was long and intense. Galileo was accused of heresy. of teaching ideas that went against the Bible. He was forced to defend his beliefs, even as he faced threats of imprisonment or worse. In the courtroom, Galileo stood alone. The church leaders demanded that he renounce his belief in the Copernican system. They showed him instruments of torture, reminding him of the consequences if he refused. Galileo was afraid. He was a man of courage, but he was also human. He didn't want to die. In the end, Galileo gave in. He recanted his belief that the earth moved around the sun. He declared that he had been wrong, that the church's teachings were correct. The Inquisition sentenced him to house arrest for the rest of his life. Galileo was broken, but he was alive. Even under house arrest, Galileo continued to work. He wrote books, conducted experiments, and studied the motion of objects. He could no longer look at the stars through his telescope, but his mind remained sharp. In his heart, he still believed in the truths he had discovered. Legend says that after recanting, Galileo muttered under his breath, "And yet, it moves." Whether or not this is true, it captures his spirit. Galileo may have been silenced, but his ideas could not be undone. The earth moved, no matter what anyone said. Galileo's willingness to question old beliefs marked a turning point in history. His discoveries inspired others to look beyond tradition and seek the truth. Though he faced persecution, his work laid the foundation for modern science. He showed the world that knowledge could not be stopped, even in the face of danger. In his final years, Galileo reflected on his life. He thought about the stars he had seen, the moons of Jupiter, and the endless mysteries of the universe. He knew he had been part of something greater than himself. The earth moved, the heavens danced, and Galileo had dared to watch. Chapter 9. The Wrath of Rome. Galileo's books were like sparks in the darkness. They lit up the minds of people across Europe. Readers marveled at his discoveries, the craters on the moon, the moons of Jupiter, and the idea that the earth was not the center of the universe. His book, Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, became famous quickly. Some called it a masterpiece. Others called it dangerous. In cities and towns, people debated the ideas in Galileo's book. Some were excited. They saw the universe in a new way and wanted to know more. But others were furious. They said Galileo was wrong, that his ideas went against tradition and the teachings of the church. The book caused a storm of controversy. In Rome, church leaders read Galileo's work with growing anger. They believed his ideas challenged the authority of the church. For centuries, the church had taught that the earth was the center of God's creation. Galileo's writings suggested otherwise. If the earth was not the center, what did that mean for their teachings? What did it mean for their power? The church decided they had to act. In 1632, they summoned Galileo to Rome. He was ordered to appear before the Inquisition, the powerful court of the Catholic Church. The Inquisition had the power to question, punish, and silence anyone they believed was a threat to the church. For Galileo, this was a terrifying moment. He was 68 years old, in poor health, and afraid of what might happen. News of Galileo's summons spread quickly. His friends begged him not to go. "Stay in Padua," they said. "They will destroy you in Rome." But Galileo knew he had no choice. If he refused to go, the church would send for him by force. And so, in early 1633, Galileo left his home and began the long journey to Rome. The road to Rome was cold and lonely. Galileo traveled slowly, his mind heavy with worry. He thought about his discoveries, about the moons of Jupiter and the phases of Venus. He thought about his telescope, the tool that had shown him the secrets of the universe. Would all his work be erased? Would he be silenced forever? When Galileo arrived in Rome, the city was quiet but tense. The Inquisition wasted no time. He was summoned to the court and questioned about his book. The judges were powerful men, dressed in dark robes, their faces stern. They demanded to know why he had written about the earth moving around the sun. "These ideas are dangerous," they said. "They go against the teachings of the church. Do you deny this?" Galileo stood before them, trembling but determined. "I wrote the truth," he said. "My observations with the telescope prove that the earth is not the center of the universe. The evidence is clear. I only seek to share what I have seen." The judges were not satisfied. They accused Galileo of heresy, of spreading ideas that could confuse and mislead people. They told him he must take back his words, that he must say he was wrong. Galileo hesitated. To deny his discoveries would go against everything he believed. But to refuse could cost him his life. The trial continued for weeks. Each day, Galileo faced hours of questioning. The judges pressured him, demanding that he admit his ideas were false. They reminded him of what had happened to others who had defied the church. Galileo knew about the torture chambers. He knew about the burning stakes. Alone in his cell at night, Galileo wrestled with his thoughts. He remembered the nights on his rooftop in Padua, staring through his telescope at the stars. He thought about the moons of Jupiter, the phases of Venus, and the mountains of the moon. He knew his discoveries were true. But was the truth worth his life? The Inquisition gave Galileo one last chance. They showed him the instruments of torture, their cold metal gleaming in the dim light. "Do you recant your ideas?" they asked. Galileo's voice shook as he answered. "I do," he said. He had no choice. He was too old, too weak to endure what might come if he refused. On June 22, 1633, Galileo was brought before the court to hear his sentence. He knelt before the judges, his hands trembling. In a solemn voice, they declared him guilty of heresy. His punishment was house arrest for the rest of his life. He was forbidden to write or speak about his ideas ever again. As part of his punishment, Galileo was forced to publicly deny the Copernican system. In front of a large crowd, he declared that the earth did not move, that the sun did not stand at the center of the universe. But in his heart, Galileo knew the truth. Legend says that as he stood up after recanting, Galileo whispered under his breath, "And yet it moves." Whether or not this is true, The words capture Galileo's spirit. He might have been forced to deny his discoveries, but the truth could not be undone. The earth moved, no matter what anyone said. Galileo returned to his home near Florence, where he lived under house arrest. He was not allowed to leave or receive visitors without permission. Guards watched him closely, ensuring that he followed the church's orders. The once great scientist was now a prisoner. But even under house arrest, Galileo's mind remained sharp. He continued to study and write in secret. He focused on new areas of science, including the motion of objects and the forces that govern the natural world. His work laid the foundation for the study of physics, inspiring future scientists like Isaac Newton. Galileo's books, though banned in his lifetime, continued to spread across Europe. His discoveries could not be silenced. People read his works in secret, passing them from hand to hand. Slowly, the ideas he had fought for began to take hold. The truth about the universe could not be hidden forever. In his final years, Galileo went blind. He could no longer look at the stars, but he still dreamed of them. He imagined the moons of Jupiter dancing around their planet, the Earth spinning quietly through space, and the sun shining at the center of it all. Despite everything, Galileo remained hopeful. He believed that one day people would understand the truth. Galileo died in 1642, still under house arrest. He did not live to see his ideas accepted, but his legacy endured. Decades later, scientists proved that he had been right all along. The Earth did move around the sun. Galileo's courage and determination had changed the way people saw the universe. Though he faced the wrath of Rome, Galileo's spirit could not be broken. He had dared to question, to observe, and to discover. And in doing so, he opened the door to a new age of science, a world where curiosity and reason could shine as brightly as the stars. Chapter 10. The Trial of the Stars. In the cold, dimly lit courtroom, Galileo stood before the Inquisition. The room was silent except for the faint crackle of torches on the stone walls. The faces of the judges were stern, their eyes fixed on the old man in front of them. Galileo, now 68 years old, felt the weight of their gaze. His heart pounded in his chest. This was the moment he had feared. The charges against him were read aloud. He was accused of heresy, of spreading dangerous ideas that went against the teachings of the Church. His book, Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, was at the center of the trial. In it, Galileo had dared to argue that the Earth moved around the sun, just as Copernicus had proposed. These ideas, the judges said, were a threat to the order of the world. "Do you deny these accusations?" the chief judge asked. His voice echoed through the room. Galileo hesitated. He looked down at his hands, trembling slightly. He thought about the nights he had spent looking through his telescope, the wonders he had seen, the moons of Jupiter, the phases of Venus, the endless stars. They had all shown him the truth. But now, that truth was dangerous. "I am a loyal son of the Church," Galileo began, his voice calm but unsteady. "I have never intended to go against its teachings. My work is based on observation, on what I have seen with my own eyes." The judges frowned. They were not interested in what Galileo had seen. To them, his observations were dangerous because they challenged centuries of tradition. For the Church, the earth was the center of God's creation. To suggest otherwise was to question everything. One of the judges leaned forward. "You wrote that the earth moves," he said sharply. "Do you still believe this?" Galileo felt his chest tighten. He wanted to shout, to tell them that his discoveries were real, that they could see the proof themselves if they only looked through his telescope. But he also knew what was at stake. The Inquisition was not just a court. It was a powerful force that could punish anyone who defied it. The judges pressed Galileo harder. They showed him instruments of torture, cold and menacing. "If you do not recant," they warned, "you will face severe consequences." Galileo's breath caught in his throat. He was an old man, frail and in poor health. He had already endured weeks of questioning, locked away in a small, dark room. He knew what the Inquisition was capable of. Others before him had been burned at the stake for similar accusations. The thought of such a fate terrified him. That night, alone in his cell, Galileo wrestled with his thoughts. He paced the small room, his hands shaking. He thought about his discoveries, the joy he had felt when he first saw Jupiter's moons dancing in the sky. He thought about the mountains on the moon, the stars too numerous to count. He thought about the truth. How could he deny it? But then he thought about his family. His daughter, Maria Celeste, had written to him during the trial, begging him to stay safe. "Father," her letter said, "do what you must to protect yourself. The world will one day understand your work."